It was a warm Saturday afternoon in early May, the kind of day when the light sits softly on everything and makes even ordinary moments feel steady. I remember because I had just finished watering the small row of lavender bushes along the front walkway. The scent lingered in the air, calm and familiar the way it had been for years. This house had its rhythms, so did I. The front door opened without a knock. That by itself wasn't unusual. My husband Daniel still had his key, but what came next didn't belong to any version of our life I recognized. He stepped inside like he had done 1,000 times before, but he wasn't alone. There was a woman walking in just half a step behind him, younger than me, composed, carrying a leather tote like she already knew where she was going to set it down. She paused just inside the doorway, her eyes moving across the living room, taking it in with quiet assessment, and then Daniel said it. Not loud, not angry, just certain. She's staying here. You need to start packing your things. For a second, I thought I had misheard him. The words didn't fit together. They didn't land like real language. They hovered somewhere just out of reach, like a line from a conversation that hadn't actually happened yet. I was still holding the watering can, my hand tightened around the handle without me realizing it. What was all I managed? He didn't look at me the way he used to, not even the distant, polite version of the past few years. This was different. This was someone already finished with the conversation. I brought the paperwork, he said, gesturing toward the envelope in his hand. It's straightforward. We'll keep this simple if you cooperate. The woman set her tote bag down on the arm of the couch, not tentatively, not like a guest, like someone placing something in her own space. I'm Ava, she said, her voice calm, almost gentle. I think it's better if we don't make this harder than it needs to be. I stared at her, then back at him. This is my house, I said, though. Even as the words left my mouth, I could hear how uncertain they sounded. Daniel exhaled slowly, as if I were the one being unreasonable. Emily, we've been over this, he said. The house is in my name. I'm not asking for a fight. I'm asking for a transition. A transition. That was the word he chose. 15 years of a life reduced to something that could be transitioned out of. I didn't move. I didn't raise my voice. Something inside me had gone very still, like a room where all the air had been quietly removed. Ava picked up a framed photo from the shelf, one of the three of us from years ago, Lucas still small, standing between us. She studied it for a moment, then set it back down carefully. Where's Lucas? Daniel asked, as if this were an ordinary visit. Upstairs, I said. He nodded, already turning away from me, already walking further into the house, like nothing about this moment required permission anymore. That was when I heard footsteps on the stairs, slow, measured. Lucas appeared at the bottom, his eyes moving from me to his father to the woman standing in our living room. He didn't say anything right away. Instead, he went back up the stairs. Daniel frowned slightly, irritation flickering across his face. What is he doing? I didn't answer. A minute passed, maybe less. It felt longer. Then Lucas came back down. He was holding a folder, not thick, not bulky, just a simple, worn manila folder, the edges slightly bent like it had been opened more than once. He walked straight into the room and stopped a few feet from his father. His voice, when he finally spoke, was steady in a way I hadn't heard before. Before she signs anything, he said, you should probably look at this. Daniel's expression shifted just slightly. Not fear, not yet, but something had cracked through the certainty. He reached for the folder, and for the first time since he walked through that door, the room went completely silent. The house didn't feel like mine anymore, even though I was still standing in the same place I had been just minutes ago. Daniel hadn't opened the folder yet. He was holding it, turning it slightly in his hands like he could feel its weight before deciding whether to look inside. Ava stood a few steps behind him, now quiet, watchful. Lucas had stepped back toward the staircase, his arms folded, his expression unreadable. No one spoke. And in that silence, something in me shifted, not outwardly, not in a way anyone in that room could see, but somewhere deeper, where memories start rearranging themselves without asking permission. because the truth was nothing that was happening right now had come out of nowhere. I just hadn't been willing to name it. For 12 years, I had built my life around a version of Daniel that felt solid enough to trust. He was practical driven, always thinking 3 steps ahead. That was what I told people when they asked about him. It sounded respectable, stable. It sounded like a man you could build a future with. When Lucas was born, I stepped back from full-time work. I still kept my position at the nonprofit, but I reduced my hours, took on fewer projects, adjusted everything around what our family needed. It wasn't a sacrifice I resented. At the time, it felt like a decision we made together. Daniel used to say things like, "You're better at holding things together than I am." I believed that meant we were a team. Over time, though, holding things together became my role alone. Daniel's work expanded. More travel, more late nights, more calls that ended quickly with "I'll explain later" and then never did. I told myself that was just how things worked when someone carried that kind of responsibility. But there were small things I noticed, little inconsistencies that didn't seem important enough to confront. Mail that arrived with slightly different return addresses, not wrong, just off. A bill redirected 1 month, then back again the next. When I asked, Daniel would shrug it off. Office routing. They're always shifting things around. Lucas noticed too. He didn't say much about his father, not in a way that pushed for answers. But once, a few months ago, he stood at the kitchen counter holding an envelope and said, "Why does Dad's stuff sometimes come from Boise and sometimes from somewhere else?" I told him it was probably work-related. He didn't argue. He just nodded like he was storing the answer rather than accepting it. That was Lucas, quiet, observant. He didn't miss much, even when he pretended not to be paying attention. And Daniel, he stopped explaining things altogether. Conversations turned into updates. Updates turned into assumptions. Assumptions turned into silence. We still had dinners together when he was home, still moved through the same routines, but something had thinned out between us. Not broken, just reduced. Like a photograph left in the sun too long, the colors slowly fading without anyone noticing the exact moment it changed. I told myself it was temporary. People go through phases. Work gets demanding. Families adjust. That's what I believed. That's what I held on to, because the alternative that something fundamental had already shifted without me was harder to face. Standing there now with a stranger in my living room and my husband treating the space like it had already been reassigned, I realized those small details hadn't been random. They had been a pattern. I just hadn't connected it. Daniel finally lifted his eyes from the folder and looked at Lucas. "What is this?" he asked, his voice controlled but no longer as certain as it had been when he walked through the door. Lucas didn't move. "It's something you forgot about," he said. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. Not anger, not yet, something closer to calculation. Ava shifted her weight, her confidence dimming just enough to notice. For the first time, she wasn't scanning the room. She was watching Daniel, waiting. I stood there, still holding the watering can, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment pressing in from all directions. For years, I had believed I was maintaining a home. Now I wasn't so sure what I had really been holding together. And as Daniel's fingers finally slipped under the edge of that folder, I understood one thing clearly. Whatever was inside it, it hadn't started today. Daniel didn't open the folder, not right away. His fingers had slipped under the edge, but something in him paused. Not hesitation exactly, more like calculation. Then, almost deliberately, he pulled his hand back. "Not now," he said, placing the folder on the coffee table like it could wait. The shift was subtle, but I felt it. Whatever was inside that folder, it mattered. Enough for him to delay it. Instead, he reached for the envelope he had brought in with him. "This is what we need to focus on," he said, sliding it across the table toward me. "The sooner we handle this, the easier it'll be for everyone." Everyone! The word didn't include me. I set the watering can down slowly and stepped closer. The envelope was thick, heavier than I expected. My name was printed neatly across the front, Emily Carter, in a clean professional font that felt impersonal in a way handwritten letters never did. I opened it carefully. Inside were documents neatly organized, clipped together in sections. divorce filings, asset breakdowns, proposed terms. I didn't rush. I read. And with every page, something inside me tightened. The house listed solely under Daniel's name, purchased before our marriage. That part was technically true, but there was no mention of the years I had spent maintaining it, improving it, building a life inside it. No acknowledgement of shared investment beyond what could be measured on paper. The financial terms were efficient. A short-term support plan, limited, defined, ending sooner than I expected, just enough to appear reasonable, not enough to sustain anything long-term. Lucas was mentioned but briefly. Custody wasn't contested. Daniel had already decided our son would stay with me. His contribution was outlined in monthly figures that felt calculated, not considered. There was a section labeled relocation consideration. I read that part twice. It outlined a timeline, 30 days to vacate. Assistance offered in the form of a one-time payment conditional upon agreement to the terms as written. 30 days. I lowered the paper slightly and looked up at him. You already decided I'm leaving, I said. Daniel met my gaze steady, composed. It's the most practical outcome, he replied. This setup doesn't make sense anymore. This setup, I repeated quietly. Ava remained silent, but she had moved closer to the kitchen area, now her presence settling into the space in a way that felt deliberate. She wasn't speaking, but she wasn't uncertain either. I turned back to the papers. There was a section on property division that listed accounts I recognized and some I didn't. Small discrepancies, nothing obvious, but enough to catch my attention. A savings account referenced under a different routing number. A property-related expense categorized in a way that didn't align with anything I remembered. It wasn't proof of anything, not yet, but it didn't fit. Why does this say relocation before the school year? I asked, my eyes still on the page. Daniel's answer came too quickly. It's better for Lucas. Clean transition. Lucas shifted slightly behind me, just enough for me to notice. That's not what you said before, he murmured. Daniel's expression flickered just for a second. What do you mean? He asked. Lucas didn't step forward. He didn't raise his voice. You said timing didn't matter, he said. Now it does. Silence settled again, but this time it felt different, thinner, less controlled. Daniel exhaled, a hint of irritation breaking through. Plans change, he said. That's all. I looked down at the documents again. Plans change. Maybe. But the details on these pages didn't feel like something that had changed. They felt like something that had been prepared, carefully, over time. I closed the packet and held it against my chest for a moment, feeling the weight of it, not just the paper, but what it represented. Not a conversation, not a decision made together, an outcome already designed. I'm not signing this today, I said. Daniel's jaw tightened. This isn't something to drag out, Emily. No, I said quietly. It's not something to rush either. For the first time since he walked in, he didn't immediately respond. His eyes shifted briefly, almost instinctively, toward the folder still sitting on the table. And in that small, unguarded movement, I understood something I hadn't fully allowed myself to see before. Whatever story he was telling me now, it wasn't the whole one. By Sunday evening, the house had gone quiet again. Daniel and Ava had left just before sunset, taking their certainty with them, but leaving everything else behind, papers on the table, tension in the air, and a silence that didn't feel like peace. Lucas stayed upstairs most of the night. I didn't call him down. I didn't know what I would say if I did. The folder was still sitting where Daniel had set it down earlier. He hadn't taken it. He hadn't even tried to. That detail stayed with me. Not because I understood it, but because I didn't. I gathered the divorce papers into a neat stack and moved them to the edge of the table. I didn't open them again. I didn't need to. I already knew what they said. What I didn't know was why everything felt so arranged. Not rushed. Arranged. Monday morning came slower than usual. Lucas left for school without much conversation. He paused at the door like he was about to say something, then just nodded and left. I stood in the kitchen longer than I needed to, staring at the coffee I hadn't touched. Then I went to my laptop. I wasn't looking for anything specific, not yet, just something to anchor the feeling that had started forming the night before. Daniel's emails were still synced on the shared family account. He hadn't removed access. That too felt deliberate. I opened the inbox and scrolled. Work updates, travel confirmations, calendar invites. Nothing unusual at first glance. But when I clicked into one of the recent travel emails, something small caught my attention. The routing header. It listed the sending location, not Chicago, not Denver, not any of the places Daniel usually mentioned. Boise. I frowned and opened another. Same thing. A third. Still Boise. That didn't make sense. Daniel had been telling me for months that he was splitting time between out-of-state offices. That was the explanation for everything, the late nights, the missed calls, the constant rescheduling. But these emails suggested something else. Not proof, just inconsistency. I leaned back in the chair, trying to organize the thought without jumping to conclusions. There were explanations. There were always explanations. Work routing systems, VPNs, corporate servers. I had heard those terms before, even if I didn't fully understand them. Still, something about the pattern felt too consistent to ignore. I closed the email and sat there for a moment, listening to the quiet of the house. Then I stood up and walked into the living room. The folder was still there. I hesitated before picking it up. It was lighter than I expected. No labels on the outside, just a worn edge and a faint crease across the front, like it had been folded once and then straightened out again. Lucas had said, "You should probably look at this. Not we found something. Not this proves anything. Just look." I didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, I set it back down exactly where it had been. Because whatever was inside it, it felt like a step I wasn't ready to take without understanding the ground I was standing on first. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. A message from Daniel. "Have you reviewed the documents we need to keep things moving? No greeting, no question about Lucas, no acknowledgement of yesterday, just movement." I stared at the screen for a long moment, then set the phone face down without replying. The pressure was starting to take shape now, not loud, not explosive, but steady. A timeline I hadn't agreed to, decisions already made, a version of events that expected me to follow along. I walked back to the table and looked at the two things sitting there, the divorce papers and the folder. One of them told me where I was supposed to go. The other, I still didn't know. But for the first time, I wasn't entirely sure the direction Daniel had set was the only one that existed. By Tuesday afternoon, I had done something I never thought I would do. I opened the folder. Not dramatically, not with shaking hands or some sudden burst of courage, just quietly at the dining room table after the house had settled into that daytime stillness that makes every small sound feel louder than it is. Inside were copies. Not originals, not official-looking legal packets, just ordinary pages Lucas had printed and tucked together in no particular order. A school registration form, an email confirmation, a scanned lease summary, a few screenshots that looked like they had been taken quickly without any thought that they might one day matter. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then I saw Daniel's name. Not once, several times. A lease for a two-bedroom rental on the north side of Boise signed 8 months earlier. An emergency contact form for a child named Ellie Reed listing Daniel Carter under household adult. A tuition deposit receipt from a private elementary school scheduled for the end of July. I read the papers once, then again slower. Ava Reed, Ellie Reed. The names matched. My eyes moved back to the school form, then to the lease. Same address, same unit number, same start date that overlapped perfectly with one of the stretches Daniel had said he was mostly in Denver. I sat there for a long time without moving, not because I didn't understand it, because I did. He hadn't simply left our marriage in his mind before telling me. He had built something else while still standing inside this one. Not just a relationship, a household, a routine, a place for another child to start school while mine was being told to adjust quietly and make room. That was the part that settled into me like a weight. Not the affair, the replacement. There was one more page near the bottom, a forwarded email between Daniel and someone from the school office. It was brief, practical, the kind of message no one remembers writing. The line that stayed with me was this: "We'd appreciate final confirmation of residential stability before placement is locked." Residential stability. That was why the divorce papers were timed the way they were, why the relocation section had been worded so cleanly, why he kept pushing the phrase before the school year. He wasn't trying to end one life, he was trying to clear space for another. When Lucas came home that afternoon, he stopped in the doorway and looked at me. Not at the folder, not at the papers spread around it, just at me. "You opened it," he said. I nodded. He set his backpack down slowly. "I didn't know if I should keep it," he admitted. "Dad asked me to scan some things a while back when his printer wasn't working right. I printed extra copies by accident. I was going to throw them away, but then—" He stopped. But then what I asked. He looked down at the edge of the table. But then he kept lying. The words were simple, no anger in them, just a quiet exhaustion that didn't belong on a 14-year-old. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and understood something I should have understood sooner. My silence had not protected him. It had only forced him to live inside confusion I was still calling patience. I reached for the divorce packet Daniel had brought and placed it beside the folder. For the first time, I looked at both things together. One file told me what I was supposed to surrender. The other showed me what had already been arranged behind my back. And right there in the plain light of an ordinary Tuesday, something in me crossed a line I could not uncross. I was no longer deciding whether to keep the peace. I was deciding whether to keep disappearing. My phone lit up with Daniel's name before dinner. I let it ring once, twice, then I answered. His voice was clipped, efficient. "I assume you've had time to think." I looked at the papers in front of me, then at Lucas, who had gone very still by the kitchen doorway. "Yes," I said. And for the first time since he walked into this house with Ava, I knew I was not going to make this easy for him. Wednesday didn't feel like a continuation of the week. It felt like a line had been drawn somewhere between Tuesday night and the moment I woke up, and everything on the other side of it required a different version of me. I didn't rush into anything. That wasn't who I was, but I didn't stay still either. After Lucas left for school, I gathered the two sets of documents again, the divorce papers Daniel had brought and the folder Lucas had kept. I placed them side by side on the dining table, not to compare them, but to remind myself what I was dealing with. One was written to move me out. The other proved something had already been moved in. I picked up my phone and searched for a family attorney in Boise. Not someone aggressive, not someone who would promise to win. I didn't need that. I needed someone who understood how things actually worked. By late morning, I was sitting across from a woman named Karen Whitfield, a family law attorney whose office overlooked a quiet parking lot just off State Street. She was in her early 50s, composed, attentive, the kind of person who listened without interrupting and didn't react until she had the full picture. I didn't tell her everything at once. I started with the divorce papers. She read them carefully, flipping each page with steady hands. "He structured this to look clean," she said finally, "but it's also very one-sided." "I figured," I replied. She glanced up. "Did you sign anything?" "No." "Good." That was the first time since Sunday that I felt like I had done something right without even knowing it. Then I slid the folder across the desk. Karen opened it slowly, her expression shifting not dramatically, but enough for me to see that what I had been looking at wasn't something she dismissed. She didn't speak for a while. "These are copies," she said eventually. "Yes. And your son had access to these?" "He printed them," I said. "Daniel asked him to scan some documents months ago." Karen nodded, thinking. "This doesn't prove everything," she said, "but it does establish a pattern. A second residence, financial overlap, potential non-disclosure." The words were clinical, but the meaning was clear. "He's been living somewhere else," I said. Karen met my eyes. "It appears that way." The room felt smaller for a moment, not because of what she confirmed, but because of what came next. "What does that mean for me?" I asked. She leaned back slightly in her chair. It means you don't rush, she said, and you don't sign anything until we've reviewed all assets and obligations properly. I nodded. And the house I asked. It's in his name, she said, but that doesn't automatically mean you have no claim. Duration of the marriage contributions, financial or otherwise, those matter. For the first time, the word contribution felt like it had weight, not just something invisible, something that could be recognized. Karen closed the folder and placed her hand on top of it. You also need to be careful, she added. If he's been structuring things quietly, he may push harder now that you're not cooperating. Push harder. That part didn't surprise me. It confirmed what I had already felt. When I left her office, the sky had turned overcast, the kind of gray that flattens everything into the same tone. My phone buzzed before I reached my car. Daniel. I stared at the name for a moment, then answered. His voice was tighter than it had been the night before. I've been calling, he said. Why haven't you responded? I've been busy, I replied. With what? I paused, not to think of an answer, but to choose how much of it to give. Reviewing what you sent, I said. That shouldn't take this long, he snapped. Emily, we agreed to keep this simple. No, I said quietly. You decided it would be simple. There was a brief silence on the line. Then his tone shifted, controlled again, but thinner now. Don't turn this into something it doesn't need to be, he said. I'm offering you a fair exit. A fair exit from my own life. I'm not signing anything yet, I said. Another pause, then sharper this time. Why not? I looked out at the parking lot at the rows of cars that had nothing to do with me and felt something steady settle into place. Because I'm not ready to leave a house I've lived in for over a decade, based on documents I didn't help create, I said. His breathing changed just slightly. You're making this harder than it has to be, he said. Maybe, I replied. Or maybe I'm just taking the time you didn't expect me to take. The line went quiet, not disconnected, just quiet. For the first time, it wasn't me waiting for him to decide what happened next. Saturday came faster than I expected, not because the days had passed quickly, but because everything in between had been stretched thin. Calls, unanswered messages left without replies, the steady pressure of something approaching whether I was ready or not. Daniel had said he would come back this weekend. He didn't say when. So when the front door opened just after noon, I wasn't surprised. I was ready. What I wasn't prepared for was the suitcase. Ava walked in first this time. Not behind him, not half a step back. She stepped into the house like she had already been invited, pulling a small rolling suitcase behind her, the wheels making a quiet, steady sound across the hardwood floor. Daniel followed a moment later, closing the door behind him with the same controlled movement I had seen all week. This isn't necessary, I said before either of them could speak. Ava didn't stop walking. She moved past the living room toward the hallway, glancing briefly at the layout like she was orienting herself. Daniel set his keys down on the entry table. We need to move forward, he said. Dragging this out isn't helping anyone. Bringing her here with luggage isn't moving forward, I replied. It's forcing something. His jaw tightened slightly. It's reality, he said. You're just refusing to accept it. Ava stopped near the hallway entrance and turned back toward us. I'm not here to cause problems, she said, her tone measured. I just think it's better if we stop pretending this situation is temporary. Temporary. The word echoed in a way that made everything sharper. Lucas appeared at the top of the stairs. He didn't come down right away. He stood there looking at the suitcase, then at his father, then at Ava. His face didn't change, but something in his posture did, like he had already decided where he stood. This isn't happening, I said more firmly now. Daniel exhaled impatience, slipping through. It is, he said. Emily, I've tried to handle this reasonably. I gave you time. I gave you terms. You're the one choosing to make it difficult. I'm choosing not to disappear, I said. The room went still for a moment. Then he stepped closer, lowering his voice. If you don't sign, this gets more complicated, he said. Legally, financially, for you. There it was. Not a threat exactly, but close enough. I held his gaze. For me, I repeated. For everyone, he corrected quickly. "You're not thinking about Lucas." At that, Lucas finally started down the stairs. Slow, steady. "I am thinking about Lucas," I said. "That's why I'm not agreeing to something that leaves him with less than he deserves." Daniel turned slightly toward him. "Lucas, this doesn't have to be a big deal," he said. "We're just figuring things out." Lucas didn't answer. He walked into the living room, stopping beside the coffee table. The folder was still there. He didn't touch it. Not yet. Instead, he looked at the suitcase again. "You're moving in?" he asked, his voice calm but direct. Ava hesitated just for a second. "I'm staying for now," she said, "until things are settled." "Things are settled," I said quietly. "You just don't like the answer." Daniel's expression hardened. "You don't get to define that," he said. "No," I replied, "but you don't get to ignore it either." He stepped back, running a hand through his hair, frustration now fully visible. "This is exactly what I was trying to avoid," he said. "Conflict, drama, lawyers. I've already spoken to one," I said. That stopped him completely. Ava's eyes shifted toward him, a flicker of uncertainty breaking through her composure. Daniel's voice dropped colder now. "You did what I got advice," I said, "before signing anything." His focus sharpened, the calm he had been trying to maintain slipping into something more defensive. "You're escalating this," he said. "No," I answered. "I'm responding to it." For a moment, no one moved. The tension in the room had changed again, not just pressure now, but resistance. Something he hadn't planned for. Daniel looked from me to the folder on the table, then back again. "This isn't over," he said. "I know," I replied. And for the first time since this began, I understood something clearly. Whatever control he thought he had walking into this house, he no longer had it. No one moved after Daniel said it wasn't over. The words stayed in the room like something metallic, cold, hard, and meant to intimidate. A week ago, they might have worked. Maybe even 3 days ago. But something had changed, and Daniel knew it. Lucas reached for the folder before his father could. Not fast, not dramatic, just with the calm precision of someone who had already decided he wasn't going to be talked around anymore. He picked it up from the coffee table, opened it, and slid out 3 pages. One he placed in front of Daniel, one he held in his own hand, the third he left face down. "What is this?" Daniel asked, but his voice had lost the steady edge it carried when he first walked in. Lucas looked at the page, not at him. "It's the property disclosure form you sent me to scan in February," he said. "The one you said was just for work." Daniel's face didn't fall apart, not yet, but it changed. Ava saw it too. I could tell by the way she turned fully toward him now, no longer pretending to stay outside the center of the conversation. Daniel gave a short, dismissive laugh. "You printed out old paperwork," he said. "That doesn't mean anything." Lucas didn't argue. He simply held up the second page. "This one is from the rental application," he said. "Same date range, different answer." Daniel went still. I didn't understand every line immediately, but I understood enough. The 2 forms weren't identical. On one, Daniel had marked that he had no other residential financial obligations. On the other, he had listed ongoing support tied to a different address, not just inconsistent, conflicting. Ava stepped closer. "What address?" she asked. Daniel didn't answer her. He looked at Lucas instead, and for the first time since all of this began, there was no authority left in his expression, only calculation turning into exposure. "That was not for you to keep," he said quietly. Lucas met his eyes. "You told me it was nothing important." The room sharpened around those words. Daniel took a step forward, reaching for the papers, but Lucas stepped back before he could touch them. It wasn't fear. It was refusal. That mattered. I looked down at the first page and then at the third one, still lying face down on the table. "What's on that one?" I asked. Lucas swallowed once. "The school deposit confirmation," he said. "For Ellie." Ava turned toward Daniel so quickly it was almost a flinch. "Ellie," she repeated. He didn't answer right away, and that silence told me more than any explanation could have. Ava's voice changed when she spoke again. Not louder, just stripped of certainty. "You told me everything was already settled," she said. Daniel's eyes flicked toward her, then toward me, then back to the papers in Lucas's hand. He was trying to find the version of this moment he could still control. There wasn't one. "What exactly did you file?" I asked him. He straightened slightly, like posture alone could restore ground under his feet. "Nothing illegal," he said too quickly. "You're both making this bigger than it is. Maybe." But men who weren't cornered didn't say things that quickly. I could feel the panic trying to enter the room, trying to scatter everything into noise. I refused to let it, so I kept my voice even. "No one's raising their voice, Daniel," I said. "We're just looking at what you wrote." He stared at me, and in that stare I saw it clearly, the first real break in the image he had brought into this house. Not anger, not superiority, fear of being documented. Lucas lowered the second page slightly, but didn't let go. Daniel's mouth tightened. His eyes moved from the papers to me, then to the suitcase by the hallway, then back again. The confidence was gone now, not destroyed, but punctured. And when he finally spoke, the words came out in a different tone entirely. "What do you want?" By Monday morning, the house felt less like a battleground and more like a waiting room. Not calmer, just sharper. Everything had moved out of the realm of denial and into process, and process has its own kind of pressure. It doesn't shout, it doesn't slam doors, it just keeps moving whether anyone is comfortable or not. Karen filed the first formal response that morning. Not a dramatic filing, not a courtroom scene, just pages submitted through the proper channels, my refusal to accept Daniel's terms as written, a request for full financial disclosure, and notice that questions now existed about inconsistent residency statements and undeclared obligations. It was enough. Not to finish anything, but to stop him from pretending this would pass through me without resistance. By noon, Daniel had called 3 times. I didn't answer the first 2. When I picked up on the third, his voice had changed again. Not cold this time, tight. "What exactly did you give your attorney?" he asked. "The documents that concern me," I said. "You're making this look like fraud. I'm making it look like paperwork you signed." Silence. Not long, just long enough. Then he exhaled hard. "Emily, you have no idea how this works. That would have frightened me a week earlier. Now it only told me he had expected me not to ask questions." Karen had been careful. She had not overreached. She had not accused him of crimes or built a fantasy out of a contradiction. She had done something smaller and far more dangerous. She had made him explain himself. By Tuesday afternoon, the explanation he owed had started costing him. His attorney requested an extension. That by itself meant nothing final, but it meant delay. It meant review. It meant the clean transition Daniel had tried to force before the school year was no longer under his control. Ava learned that before I did. She texted him while he was still in the middle of a call with me. I knew because I could hear the pause, the shift in his breathing, the sound of another notification arriving before he answered the one in front of him. When he spoke again, his focus was divided. "You didn't need to bring her into this," he said. I understood immediately who he meant. "She brought herself into my house," I replied. That landed. Ava had not left him entirely, not yet, but she had stepped back. Not out of loyalty to me, out of fear of instability. The school placement for Ellie had not been finalized. The rental disclosures no longer looked routine. And men who build 2 lives rarely prepare well for the moment those lives are forced to stand in the same light. By Wednesday, Karen called with the next piece. Daniel's revised financial disclosures had arrived. They were incomplete, not carelessly incomplete, strategically incomplete, a missing account reference, an expense category reshaped, a support line reframed. Karen's voice stayed level as she walked me through it. "He's still trying to narrow the frame," she said. "That usually means he's hoping the pressure of time works in his favor." And if it doesn't, I asked. "He loses the advantage of speed." That mattered more than I had expected, because Daniel's real leverage had never been truth. It had been urgency. Pack, sign, relocate, adjust. He had counted on motion making me smaller. Instead, the motion had turned on him. By Thursday evening, Lucas came into the kitchen while I was standing over the sink and asked the question I had been avoiding. Is he going to lose everything? I turned and looked at him. No, I said. That's not what this is. Lucas nodded once, but he didn't leave. He should lose something, he said quietly. There was no bitterness in his voice. That was what stayed with me. Just clarity. I dried my hands and leaned against the counter. He already is, I said. And it was true. Not because I had destroyed him, because the version of himself he had relied on organized in control ahead of everyone else was beginning to crack under the weight of his own documents. That night, Daniel sent a final message before midnight. We need to resolve this privately. Don't make this worse. I read it once and set the phone down. Outside, the porch light cast a pale square across the front walk, catching the edges of the lavender bushes I had watered what now felt like a lifetime ago. He still thought worse meant harder for him. He still didn't understand that the worst part had already happened the moment he decided my silence was something he could build on. And now, for the first time, he was the one living inside consequences he could not arrange away. By the following Friday, the pace finally changed. Not because things had slowed down, but because they had settled into place. Karen called just after noon with the update that mattered. Daniel had agreed to revise terms, not willingly, not cleanly, but clearly. Full financial disclosure was now on record. The second residence had been acknowledged not as a confession, but as a fact that could no longer be omitted without consequence. The timeline he had tried to control had collapsed under review, and with it the leverage he thought he had. The house remained under his name. But I was granted the right to remain for a defined period with financial compensation adjusted to reflect the years that had been invisible on paper before. Lucas's support terms were extended and formalized, no longer left to interpretation or convenience. It wasn't everything, but it was fair. More importantly, it was no longer something I had to negotiate alone. Daniel didn't come back to the house after that. He sent one final email through his attorney, brief, structured, distant. No explanations, no attempt to rewrite what had happened, just agreement. Ava was no longer mentioned, not in the documents, not in anything that followed. Whatever version of certainty she had walked in with that first Saturday had not survived the week. That part didn't bring me satisfaction. It just ended. On Sunday morning, I was back outside, standing near the lavender bushes at the front of the house. The air was cooler than it had been the week before. The scent was still there, faint but steady, like something that didn't need attention to remain what it was. Lucas came out a few minutes later holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed me one without saying anything. We stood there for a while, not talking. "You're staying," he said eventually. "Yes." He nodded once. Good, that was all he said. But it was enough. Inside the folder was still on the dining table. I hadn't thrown it away. I hadn't filed it anywhere official either. It didn't belong in the process that had taken over everything else. It belonged to a moment, a line that had been crossed and then redrawn. I picked it up later that afternoon and placed it in a drawer in the hallway. Not to hide it, not to forget, just to let it be something that had served its purpose. Daniel still existed in our lives. He called Lucas. He showed up when scheduled. He spoke carefully now, like someone who understood that words could be measured against records. But the version of him that had walked through that door with a suitcase and a plan no longer had a place here. Not in this house, not in the space I had rebuilt. That week didn't end with a victory. It ended with something quieter. I didn't get everything back, but I stopped losing what mattered. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping yourself, I'd really like to hear how you saw it. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if this story stayed with you, you can follow along for more stories like this.